Waking Sleeping Beauty was released in 2009 and was directed by Don Hahn, a former producer at Walt Disney's animation department, and follows the story of the Disney Renaissance, an incredibly prolific, successful, and prestigious decade that saw the fall in Walt Disney Animation Studios' unexpected, progressive, triumphant return to excellence. That's what the description for this film says on IMDb, but I think it's much more about the tensions that develop behind the scenes through this time of reinvention in the studio, young animators attempting to prove themselves, and a new guard leading to one of Disney's greatest success stories. I had another film I planned to talk about for this week, but something drew me to rewatch this documentary, and so here we are. I watched this documentary for the first time just a few years ago on Disney Plus, and I absolutely fell in love with it, and it's quickly become one of my favorite documentaries to watch and rewatch some more. The history of Disney is so interesting to me, and there is no era for the company more interesting to me than the Disney Renaissance, where the studio was releasing hit after hit. Some of these films are now up there as some of the greatest animated films ever made. It's just the perfect example of the right people being involved at just the right time. Now, since this is a documentary, and as such has a different kind of behind-the-scenes history, there was very little I could find about the making of this film. So to fill out some of the time for the behind-the-scenes history, I want to talk a little bit about the people involved in the documentary as well. So, as we always do here, let's go behind the scenes to see just how this film was made, or in this case, who was involved. It'll be interesting to note that director Don Hahn used no on-camera interviews and instead used mainly archival interviews, press kit footage, in progress, and completed footage from the films that are covered in the documentary, and personal films shot by the employees of the animation studio. Hahn himself served as the documentary's narrator, with the audio-only interviews being done by former executives of the company, such as Michael Eisner, Jeffrey Katzenberg, Roy E. Disney, and animators and directors Mike Gabriel, Rob Minkoff, Roger Allers, Gary Trousdale, and Kirk Wise. Footage also includes filmmakers such as a young Tim Burton, John Lasseter, Don Bluth, Ron Clements, John Musker, Steven Spielberg, Robert Zemeckis, Richard Williams, and George Scribner. Also included are Howard Ashman, Alan Menken, Jodie Benson, Robin Williams, Paige O'Hara, Jerry Orbach, Angela Lansbury, Jeremy Irons, Nathan Lane, Elton John, and Tim Rice. A large portion of the footage seen in the film was shot by John Lasseter and Joe Ranft for Randy Cartwright, who gives studio tours in 1980 and 1984 and 1990. The film would end up being dedicated to Howard Ashman, former Disney president Frank Wells, animator Joe Ranft, and Roy E. Disney himself. The film was released in 2009 to generally positive reception, though it was criticized for not being too deep and remaining mostly surface level. The film would go on to earn a Special Achievement Award at the 2010 Annie Awards and was even nominated for Best Documentary Feature at the 2010 St. Louis Gateway Film Critics Association Awards. Now, before we get started on my actual thoughts on the documentary, I want to quickly go over some of the main players who were involved. Obviously, we have the director of the film himself, Don Hahn, who started out in animation and was an assistant director of The Fox and the Hound. He would have some hand in the making of the tail end of the 80s Disney films and into the Renaissance era as a producer. Michael Eisner was the fairly unpopular CEO of Disney and worked at the company from 1984 to 2005. He was brought in with Frank Wells, who would work as the president of the company as well. Then we have Jeffrey Katzenberg himself, who was brought in to oversee the operations at Disney Animation. And though he was seen as a ruthless leader and slightly unpopular within the company, he was one of the key contributors to ushering in the Disney Renaissance. There are several others, such as Roy Disney as well, but these are the main ones the documentary focuses attention on, especially the relationships between Eisner, Wells, Katzenberg, and Roy Disney, which would constantly be filled with tension. So, with all that said, let's talk about my own thoughts on this interesting documentary. Right off the bat, Waking Sleeping Beauty is an interesting documentary that decides to completely disregard the talking heads portion of most documentaries, where we watch a person being interviewed talking directly to us, the audience, and I think this makes for a documentary that has a lot more in common with a narrative film. There's a story director Don Hahn wants to tell you and uses a majority of the footage to explore that narrative and has his own narration to guide you through the story when necessary. And it completely cuts out the interview angle that plagues most documentaries. And it's something I really admire, and it's something he would even do again in his pseudo-companion film to this one, Howard, about songwriter Howard Ashman. And what exactly is the narrative Don Hahn wants to tell? Well, it's easy to say it's a documentary about the birth of the Disney Renaissance, but I feel like that's a very surface-level approach. Waking Sleeping Beauty is about how the young animators at Disney, wanting desperately to prove themselves, stood up for themselves and accomplished a period of time that is truly magical. It also, much like any drama, gives us a rising force in the production world with the hero and antagonist of the story, Jeffrey Katzenberg, who is the one we really follow through this entire documentary's narrative journey. I'm obsessed with Disney history, which you would be able to tell by watching my monthly reviews on the Disney animated films, but this period of time has always fascinated me because it's one of the most impressive 180s in studio history. As the documentary brings up, Disney was not in a good place financially by the 1980s. They were having less successful films, both box office-wise and critically, with the release of The Black Cauldron being the most disastrous of their productions, costing a record $40 million and only making around half of that. The young Disney animators were trapped by members of the old guard at Disney, not being able to explore the things they wanted. Then we get the emergence of Jeffrey Katzenberg, and though he himself is a very controversial figure in the company, he was crucial in the success of the Renaissance. And most of the tension seen in the film comes from Katzenberg's relationship with the other Disney animators. One of the first things he did when overseeing the animation division was cutting out several horrific moments from The Black Cauldron he found too terrifying. He was told by the animators how he couldn't edit an animated film, but damn it, he sure was going to show them. Eventually, it was Eisner who stopped this whole thing and had already put Katzenberg in a bad place with the animators. Katzenberg would make many mistakes along the way in his first few years at Disney, even going on to say he was not interested in the Academy Awards, but instead the Bank of America Awards, which was a horrible thing to say to a group of animators who cared more about the artistry than the box office. Some of the most interesting parts of this documentary are the tensions between animators and producers and CEOs and pretty much everyone. But I think it's a good example of showing that not everything is perfect. As great as this period is for Disney, there was a lot of backstage drama brought about by butting heads, especially tension formed between Roy Disney, Eisner, Frank Wells, and Katzenberg. And it was Frank Wells who was the one that kind of held it all together for a while, and I'll go more into that in a little bit. I also want to mention my favorite part of the documentary, and the section that would eventually become its own documentary just a few years ago, and that is the section on Howard Ashman. One thing that solidifies the early Renaissance period as one of Disney Company's finest moments is the music, all thanks to the work of two men, Howard Ashman and Alan Menken. These two single-handedly wrote and composed two of the greatest Disney soundtracks that has ever been written. Howard Ashman is a very interesting man, and I'd love to go into more detail one day on the documentary about him. But this guy was truly a legend and understood not only music, but character and story as well. He had a profound influence on many decisions that would make it into both Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast. And he and Alan Menken together made what I believe to be the greatest Disney song ever made, Part of Your World, from The Little Mermaid. Menken and Ashman would eventually be signed on to compose Aladdin as well as some other Disney films later on, but sadly Howard Ashman would pass away after battling AIDS. And one of my favorite moments in the documentary talks about how the producers of Beauty and the Beast showed a rough cut of the film at a film festival where the film received overwhelming positive reactions, and the producers visit Ashman literally on his deathbed to tell him the good news, and they assured him that Beauty and the Beast would be a hit, which would ultimately prove true, as the film would go on to be the first animated film nominated for Best Picture, and Katzenberg began to get his wish, as a majority of the films in the Renaissance were box office darlings. However, things were not always up at the studio. As Disney was pumping out these big spectacles a year at a time, it became hard to keep up that momentum, and Katzenberg pushed for films such as Lion King and especially his own passion project, Pocahontas. However, behind the scenes, things were not looking good, especially with the death of Disney president Frank Wells. With the death of Wells, pretty much everything began to unravel. Katzenberg wasn't receiving a promotion he desperately wanted. Tensions between Roy Disney and Eisner increased, and it eventually led to Katzenberg's resignation from the Disney company just weeks after the release of The Lion King, Disney's most successful film during the Renaissance. However, great news for Katzenberg, as he would soon after develop his own animation company, DreamWorks, with Steven Spielberg and David Geffen. I love this documentary as a whole. I think it does such a great job of telling a very interesting story and giving us a real glimpse into the inner workings of Disney during their most triumphant moment. However, there are parts of it, to me, that feel like Don Hahn could have gone farther, and I'm sure some of that has to do with maintaining the reputation of many of the people involved, but I think at least showing some of the mess that was going on around that time was a good idea. I do wish, however, that the documentary went a bit more into detail about the making of Aladdin, as they definitely skim over that part, and I also think by making Katzenberg almost the main focus of the documentary, it doesn't allow them to go even farther down the line of the later Disney Renaissance films, which are perhaps even more ambitious than what came before. So ultimately, the film feels like half a story and set up for a sequel that I don't think will ever happen. I would love for someone to do that, though, and make a comprehensive documentary on maybe the entire Renaissance, or at least Pocahontas to Tarzan. Other than that, I think this is a really great documentary. It provides us with some great insight and has a unique way of telling its story without resorting to the talking head formula shown in most other documentaries. I think if it was just a bit longer and went into a bit more detail, this would be one of the greatest documentaries I've ever seen. But I can't help but have that feeling like I'm missing information and not getting the whole story. Nonetheless, this is a really interesting watch and definitely worth anyone's time that wants to learn a little bit more about how the Disney Renaissance got started in the first place. So, with all that said, I'm going to give Waking Sleeping Beauty an 8 out of 10. Well, guys, I want to thank you for watching this review. This is a documentary I watch a lot when I have nothing better to do, and I find it to be a fascinating look into the creative process, and I would definitely recommend it to any Disney fan. But anyway, with all that said, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel, and stay positive.